On Labor Day weekend in 1965, New York Daily News reporter Bill Federici was waiting outside of a phone booth in West Palm Beach, Florida. When the phone rang, he stepped inside the phone booth, answered the phone, and was instructed to turn around, face the doors, and reach up. Federici followed those instructions, and when he did, he realized he had the story of a lifetime. And without further ado, let's get into that story. Jack Roland Murphy was a swimming instructor at a luxurious hotel in Miami Beach, Florida. He was a great athlete. He had earned a tennis scholarship to play at the University of Pittsburgh and was a great violinist as well, and was even invited to play for the Pittsburgh Symphony. Born in Los Angeles, Murphy's family would move just outside of Pittsburgh when he reached high school. But this California kid hated the cold. In fact, he went to go see a movie during a snowstorm in the winter of 1955, and on his way there, all he could think was, I'm going to die in this wintry city someday. I'd love to live in a warm weather state again. The movie that he went to go see was set in Miami, and all he could focus on, despite all of the criminal underworld stuff going on in the movie, all he could focus on was that sunshine. He wanted to live in that sunshine again. When the movie was over, he went home, packed a bag, and hopped on the very first train out of Pittsburgh headed down to Florida. Along the way, he would pick up surfing. He actually became a champion surfer, and it helped earn him the nickname Murph the Surf. He tried opening a surfboard shop, but that failed unfortunately, and he fell into a depression, and he would start taking any lower paying jobs that he could find in order to help make ends meet. Any money that he was earning, though, he was just blowing on drugs and alcohol. He thrived on that party lifestyle. Now, he was looking for any way to earn some extra money, and it turned out that a few friends of his invited him to do a job with them. However, this job happened to be very illegal. So what they did was they all hopped on this boat, and they took a little nighttime excursion behind a bunch of Florida mansions. They picked one mansion, and they docked the boat behind it, and then everyone got off of the boat except for Murphy. His job was to stay on the boat and keep an eye out, let them know if anyone was coming. After a short stint of time, the group came back to the boat and they were holding this bag of loot, and they passed it off to Murphy. Because of Murphy's athleticism, his job was different than everybody else's. He was to take this bag of loot and swim across Biscayne Bay. Murphy was their failsafe in case they tripped any alarms and would have the authorities on their tail. When the authorities did find them, there was no loot or anything to associate them with the crime that had just happened, so they were let off free. When everyone met up again, Murphy received his cut, which was right around $15,000. Murph the Surf had a new business now, burglary, with a specialty in jewels. Murphy recruited a fellow swimming instructor from the hotel that he worked at named Allan Kuhn. Kuhn grew up in a one-parent household and he was incredibly athletic, but he did grow up in a poor part of Missouri, and his first robbery arrest occurred when he was only 15 years old. Kuhn relocated from Missouri to Miami after serving in the U.S. Navy, and it was here that he would meet Murph the Surf. The two of them knew of each other, but they didn't really get to talking until Kuhn was lured by a bartender to a back room where Murphy was recovering from a bullet wound. Murphy told him, hey, I was shot at by the police while I was trying to rob a coin store. And then he dared Kuhn to finish the job. This may seem like an obvious no to you and me, but to Kuhn, he was very interested. Kuhn went to the store, he found the hole in the ceiling that Murphy had cut, then he lowered himself down with a length of rope, then he nabbed everything that he could. He got such a rush from this job. The previous day, he had earned $100 in tips from his job, but just a few days later, he received a package worth $180,000. And so Kuhn and Murph the Surf would get this rush from robbing newlyweds and tourists and divorcees. They'd spend their winnings on apartments and cars and speedboats. They weren't exactly hiding their wealth. In fact, you get enough booze inside these guys, and they'd often brag to their friends about their accomplishments. One of their friends was Herman Gordon, also known as Jaime the Fence, and Jaime was interested in potential scores of his own. Jaime told the two seasoned thieves that there was a 12-carat emerald-cut ring sitting in a home in Palm Beach. He knew that for a fact. So he told the two of them, if you can retrieve the jewel, I'll sell it and we'll all make a big profit. And so the two of them, with ease, broke into this home and they took this ring, brought it to Jaime, But upon further inspection, he realized this wasn't the real gem, it was a fake. So he came to the conclusion the owners must still have the real gem, and they're out in the Hamptons, which is in eastern Long Island in New York. And so the surfer boys waved goodbye to Jaime the Fence and said, "We'll see you in a little while," and they ventured off to New York together. Welcome to New York, 1964, home of the World's Fair. Kuhn and Murph the Surf would meet up with a third accomplice, a painter named Roger Clark. Clark was also a former Navy man like Kuhn was, however, he was not a professional thief like these two. So his job was simply to be their getaway man. He was cool, calm, and collected, and desperately needed money. Now, being that these were party boys, they didn't want to go straight out to the Hamptons. They wanted to enjoy New York City a little bit. They attended the World's Fair, they went to some jazz clubs, and they hit up a bunch of museums as well. These boys could not look more out of place. They're in New York City, and they look like beach boys. They have colorful shirts, argyle socks, tanned faces, big muscular bodies, but this doesn't matter to them because they're used to being the life of the party. They checked into the Cambridge House Hotel, which was just a few blocks away from one of the most famous museums in New York City, which is the American Museum of Natural History. So they figured while we're here, why not go look at some dinosaur bones? As they walked through the exhibits in the museum, they came upon the Morgan Gallery, and all they saw was dollar signs. J.P. Morgan, the hotshot banker of the Gilded Age, donated several expensive gems and minerals to be put on display at the Museum of Natural History. Among this collection was the rare 16-carat eagle diamond, the 116.75-carat purple-violet midnight star, the 563.65-carat Star of India, and the 100.3-carat DeLong Star ruby. These gems alone had a value over $400,000 or $3.3 million today. Cha-ching! From that point forward, the men were no longer interested in some emerald miles and miles away out on Long Island. They wanted the challenge. So they scoped out the place. They looked for any small details that might help them accomplish their goal. The first thing they noticed was that there was minimal security throughout the entire building. They also noticed that inside of these display cases, there were these batteries, but they appeared to be corroded. So in all likelihood, any alarms that were inside of these cases probably didn't work. And the last thing that they noticed was that the windows were left open just a couple of inches in order to air out the place. Even though it was pretty cold outside, the number of people passing through the museum might make the place warm up pretty quickly, and air conditioning hadn't been installed inside of the building until the 1990s. So odds are they might leave these windows open overnight because they're up on the 4th floor. So they had to weigh their options here. It was a risk and reward kind of situation. Do you think any of these obstacles could potentially get in our way when we're trying to commit this jewel heist? And they determined it was worth it to try. The first thing they did was change their clothes. They wanted to look a little less conspicuous, but still nice. Murph the Surf said, "Hey, if we get caught, we may as well look good, right?" For the next few days, they would stake out the museum and try to time out all of the guards' rounds and when their shifts ended. It was starting to seem more and more likely that this was possible. In fact, they started partying back at their hotel a few nights beforehand because they were convinced that this was going to work. They tipped a bellboy $100 just for bringing liquor to their room. They'd have girls in their room. In fact, one in particular was a 19-year-old girl named Janet Florkowitz, who began having a little bit of a relationship with the 26-year-old Allan Kuhn at the time. She played a very important role in all of this that she was unaware of, but we'll get back to that in just a little bit. For now, let's get to the night of the theft attempt, October 29th, 1964, a bitterly cold night. Roger Clark drove up to the back of the American Museum of Natural History in Kuhn's white Cadillac around 9 p.m. Murphy and Kuhn both exited the car with a little bit of gear in hand. Now, going around the perimeter of the museum was this tall spiked steel fence, so the boys would have to climb over that and drop into the courtyard, careful not to get caught on the spikes at the top of this fence. Once they were over this fence, they had the museum's 125-foot wall in front of them. This was Kuhn's job. Kuhn had to climb this wall up to the 5th floor ledge. For anyone else, this might have seemed like an impossible task, but Kuhn was a master at work. He was able to scale this wall like a rock climber. Kuhn lowered the rope down to Murphy, and Murphy scaled the wall using the rope, climbed up to that ledge. This ledge was only 14 inches wide, so their feet barely had any room before they would be dangling over the side, and they could fall to their potential death. They're 5 stories high. They put their backs against the wall and they shimmied along until they were able to reach the 4th floor roof so they could drop down to that, and they did all of this with ease. These were masters at work. When they reached the windows, they saw the windows were in fact still open a couple of inches. So they pushed the windows further open, contorted their bodies, slipped through the window, and now they were inside the empty museum. Now you could get to work right away, but then you run the risk of security showing up and thwarting the entire mission, and so they waited. And waited, and waited. Enough time passed by where they said, you know what? I don't think security's coming. And they got to work. They used tape and glass cutters to open these display cases, and as they were working, they realized, you know what? No alarms are going off at all. None of them work. Over the next few hours, they would meticulously remove 24 gems from their display cases. They'd stuff them in their loot bags, and then around midnight, they exited the museum back out through the window that they came in. They dropped down, they climbed the fence, and went into Central Park. When they got into the park, Murphy actually stopped Kuhn because he noticed right up the path was a big number of police officers. Did these officers know? Did they know that there was a break-in at the museum? Murphy read their body language and said, no, I don't think that's what's going on here. I think they're just changing shifts, so we need to be a little less suspicious. Murphy noticed another man nearby who was just walking his dog, so he decided to go up to the man and just start a conversation. He just started asking questions about the dog. When 2 officers from that group approached them, Murphy just turned to them and said, "Good evening, officers." And they nodded at him, and then they continued along their way. They were in the clear. Meanwhile, Roger Clark, the getaway driver, he's been sitting in the car for hours waiting for these boys to reach the pickup spot, which they never did. By 2 a.m., he's tired, he's nervous, he's freezing, and so he decided it's time to leave. Clark gets back to the hotel, and what do you know, Murph the Surf and Kuhn are already there. They have the gems spread out on the bed, and they are celebrating. They have booze in hand. For the trio, the entire night,
great success.
The following morning, before the museum even opened up, security guard John Hoffman was making his rounds, and when he reached the Hall of Gems, his jaw just dropped wide open. He didn't know what to do. He ran for the phone. He dialed the police. The police can barely make out any of the words he's saying because he's just so frazzled. The police shut the museum down for the day, but it was too late. Murphy and Kuhn were already on their way back to Miami under assumed names. Alongside them was Janet Florkowitz, the girl that Kuhn had seduced at the hotel room. Little did she know what was inside the yellow case that she carried onto the plane. She was their unsuspecting smuggler. Roger Clark, the getaway driver, instead went to Connecticut to go see his family, and then he was to come back to New York and clean up the hotel room and meet up with them again in Miami. However, because the boys had been so rowdy at the hotel during their stay, and then it just happened to quiet down immediately after this robbery, the hotel staff started to wonder if maybe there was some sort of connection between the two. So they contacted the police. When the police arrived to the hotel and took a look at this room that the boys had stayed in, there was an overwhelming amount of evidence that they had the right guys. That and the fact that when Roger Clark returned and saw detectives in his room, he immediately caved and confessed. There was one big problem, though. The gems weren't there. They were in Miami. When the boys landed in Miami, they paid a visit to their old friend Dickie Pearson, who was a former partner in crime at a yacht broker. They asked him, "Can you bury some of these gems in your backyard? We can't move all of them right away, and we'll give you a cut if you agree to do that." So he agreed. Police got to the boys in Miami, but by the time they did, the jewels were gone. So they did arrest them, but they'd only stay in jail for a few nights before being released on bail. Even though these boys had clearly committed an insane crime, it was also a victimless crime. Nobody got hurt. And so when these boys were being marched through the streets of New York, people actually cheered them on as if they were celebrities. And this just angered the police more. They knew they had to win this battle. They had to find these gems. These surfer boys cannot beat us. Weeks later, masked men would show up to Dickie Pearson's house and demand that he hand over the jewels. They somehow knew that the jewels were on his property. However, he never caved, even though he had been pistol whipped during the process. He did know, though, that the gems couldn't stay here forever. Meanwhile, anyone who had something stolen recently would call in tips regarding the Beach Boys. But Murph the Surf was very cocky, and of course, if he was involved with the robbery, he'd admit to it. But if something never happened, he'd deny it. The most well-known of these accusers was Ava Gabor. Ava Gabor came from a famous family. She had a successful Hollywood career up to this point. This is even before she had done voices in Disney movies like The Aristocats or The Rescuers or The Rescuers Down Under. Ava's $25,000 diamond ring had been stolen, and she picked Kuhn and Murphy out of a police lineup. However, they denied involvement and said that she only picked them because their picture had been in the newspaper. The charges were later dropped because Ava Gabor never showed up to court since she was filming Green Acres, which was a CBS sitcom that ran for 6 years. But this accusation was enough to raise the price of bail to $150,000, meaning that the Beach Boys were going back to prison, and they were going to the Tombs, which was a notoriously rough Manhattan prison. Allan Kuhn was terrified of the Tombs. He wanted out of there as quickly as possible. So he talked to Murphy and said, "I think we should give up the jewels." And Murphy was very reluctant, but eventually he agreed to help. Jaime the Fence, who had originally sent these boys to New York in the first place, he knew the current location of these jewels because they had moved from Dickie Pearson's backyard. He agreed to help as long as his name could be cleared, so a deal was struck. A message got passed along to the police, along with a key that pointed them to bus station locker 0911 in downtown Miami. The detective was staying in a hotel room. He went to this locker and retrieved the loot bag from inside, and he brought it back to his hotel room. That way he could dump all of its contents onto the bed. Out of this bag came 2 aquamarines, 5 emeralds, a small sapphire, the Midnight Star, and the Star of India, which was the size of a golf ball. Most of these smaller gems had been sold off already, so in all likelihood would probably never be recovered. But there were still 2 key jewels that were missing. One was the Eagle Diamond, which today would be valued around $20,000. But the other was the DeLong Star Ruby, which today would be valued closer to $450,000. To this day, we have no idea what happened to the Eagle Diamond. In all likelihood, it was cut into smaller pieces and sold off separately. However, the DeLong Star Ruby has a more interesting story. Francis Antell was a freelance magazine writer living in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. He was obsessed with this story and was looking for any leads to help him solve the puzzle. Even though the Beach Boys were locked up at Rikers Island for the next 3 years, Antell was somehow able to connect them to Dickie Pearson, their associate who once had the jewels buried in his backyard. Pearson told him, "I know who has the ruby, but they're not going to part with it unless they have complete immunity from prosecution." Pearson also wanted a payoff for helping to recover the ruby. Antell needed someone with the credentials to help him find somebody who was willing to pay this ransom. So he contacted the New York Daily News and got in contact with crime reporter Bill Federici. They worked together to find John D. MacArthur, an insurance magnate, but more importantly, a billionaire who was willing to part with $25,000 to recover this jewel. Antell, Federici, and MacArthur all flew to Florida together, and when they landed, MacArthur handed $25,000 in 50s and 100s to Antell, and his job was to give it to Pearson, but only in the event that they recovered the jewel. Otherwise, no deal. Federici and MacArthur were instructed to go to a phone booth at the West Palm Beach Service Plaza along the Sunshine State Parkway, which is now called Florida's Turnpike, and there they would await further instructions. They also had a photographer with them in the event that they found the jewel. They'd obviously want a picture for the newspaper. Minutes later, the phone rang and Federici stepped into the phone booth and he listened to the instructions while MacArthur and the photographer were just a few feet away, and the instructions led him right to the jewel. Federici shouting, "I've got it, this is it." Then he hands it over to MacArthur, and MacArthur verifies that it is in fact the real jewel, and then he tells Antell to hand over the $25,000. Here is a photo of the front page of the New York Daily News the following morning. The following Sunday, which would have been September 5th, 1965, all of these recovered jewels would be back on display at the Natural History Museum in New York, but also with much better security. Several months later, Dickie Pearson was arrested for burglarizing a jewelry store. As for the Beach Boys, they did not serve their full sentences at Rikers thanks to cooperating for retrieving the jewels again. Roger Clark, the getaway driver, he never committed another crime in his life. He died in 2007. Allan Kuhn did get arrested one more time for an unrelated crime, but he cleaned up his act after his release. He started his own business, and he died in 2017. And then there's Jack Roland Murphy, aka Murph the Surf. We don't have time for another Murph the Surf story, but he was actually connected to a murder case and was sentenced to life in prison. He was released in 1986 on parole thanks to good behavior, and then he died in 2020. So that's going to do it, folks. One twist after another, am I right? This is like a real-life Oceans movie, I guess. If you have something you want to say, make sure to put it in the comments. Make sure to like and subscribe and all that jazz. And until next time, deuces, kids.